I'm Jacob Pierri of AusetGypsy.com and AusetGypsy Metaphysical Emporium in historic downtown Easton, Pennsylvania. Today I'm going to be bringing you the topic of astrology in tarot cards. Now, both topics are very extensive and both have very rich histories. So I'll go into a little bit of each history of astrology and tarot. Although it's outside of the scope of this video to cover both, because that would take many videos, I want to explain how to incorporate astrology into tarot from the AusetGypsy point of view. I also like to note that every different metaphysical school of thought does things a little bit differently, and this is one of many ways to do it. So I hope that it inspires you, and I hope that you play around with this technique a little bit, and I hope that it unlocks new doors for the potential of your use of astrology and tarot. Forgive me for using notes. This is a little bit of an extensive class, and it's a little intensive. When I provide this class in person, it's broken up into two different time slots, so it's usually 2 days. So I'm going to be referring down to my notes, and I don't want you to think I'm rude by looking down. It's just a lot of information to cover in a small period of time. And I think I outlined in my notes what I would probably go overboard in saying. The purpose of this class is to associate tarot with the zodiac through the use of aspects and mandalas and astrological definitions. Now, there is a lot to cover in astrology, and as we know, astrology covers the 12 signs of the zodiac, the 12 ruling planets, the 12 houses, and then it can be broken down into different decans, different seasons of the year, and so on and etc. Astrology is a giant clock in the sky letting us know what time it is. So when we do a birth chart and we see the splay of stars laid out on the chart, it tells us what time that person, place, or thing was born. And it gives us some information and some guidelines on what to expect from that person, place, or thing. Now, much like the rest of the heavens, we are constantly evolving, moving, and growing. So every second, every minute, every hour, every day, every month, every year constantly has us in motion, much like the stars and heavenly bodies around us. So as we grow, our astrology chart changes, and there are some personal planets and there are some generational planets, and these all affect us. Now, astrology is the strong foundation of, I would say, all and most metaphysics. Others might disagree. However, astrology is very important because, again, it's our clock and tells us always what time it is. So to go through the zodiac, beginning with Aries, which is usually referred to as, and collaborates with the first house as the self. The second is Taurus, which is connected to the second house of the zodiac, which is material things and possessions. The third is Gemini, which relates to the third house of the zodiac, which is corresponding to communication. The fourth is Cancer, which relates to the fourth house of astrology, which is the mother. The fifth is Leo, which corresponds with the fifth house, which is personal ego and how one identifies with themselves. The sixth becomes Virgo, and it correlates with the sixth house of the zodiac, and it is work ethic. The seventh would be Libra, which corresponds to the seventh house and correlates to relationships. The eighth house is Scorpio, which relates to the eighth house in the zodiac and also relates to the father, sex, regeneration, and also things corresponding to the father. The ninth, which becomes the ninth house, is Sagittarius, which correlates to our travel and experience. 10 in the 10th house would be Capricorn, which relates to our place in society. The 11th is Aquarius, which relates to the 11th house and our friendships and our unique gifts in this life. And then finally, the 12th sign is Pisces, which is the 12th house, which is unconscious hopes, fears, and dreams. Now, we take from that a lot of information, and there's anything from simple folk astrology to modern versions of astrology that get very, very, very super technical. We're not going to cover anything really technical with that because, believe it or not, what we're already covering is quite technical. Now, astrology has a very rich history that cultivates from all over the world. There's not one place we can really pinpoint it, and there are several different versions of astrology that have popped up and gone away throughout history. A lot of Western world astrology is based on the astrology created probably between the Babylonians and the Egyptians, which was then taught and lent to the Greeks, which made its way into Rome, and then from Rome into Europe. Then the Dark Ages hit, and we lose a lot of Western astrology, and it was preserved by the Arabs in the Middle East. They used astrology very carefully and very seriously in calculating and timing things due to alchemy, which would later then become medicine. We also have Vedic astrology, which is the astrology practiced by Hindus and people living in India and that area, which then we also can cross the border and go into China and talk about Chinese astrology, which is much different than both. Now, that's a lot of ground and a lot of history and a lot of cultures to cover, so you see what I'm saying. To try to talk about all of that and cover that's a little impossible and out of the scope of this video. But it shows how important astrology is, and how important astrology is as a clock. Now, we enter the tarot. The tarot came much later than astrology, and astrology was applied to tarot much later in tarot's history as well, too. Although there's many different schools of thoughts on that, and many people might disagree or debate you on this. There is the mythical history of tarot, which brings us as far back as realms as Atlantis and Lemuria, and then there is historical tarot, which brings us closer up to the 1400s, or the 14th century, 1300s, when playing cards started making their way onto the scene in Europe. And then again, there's debate in this topic. Was paper, as we know it, created in China, or was it created by the Moors? Again, a whole history to explore for yourself, and not completely for the scope of this video. But the history of tarot is important because as metaphysicians and practicing occultists started to record, the tarot became the perfect place to record information on. So a lot of astrology and Kabbalah and many other different diverse folk magics, ceremonial magic, and rituals were applied to the tarot as a recording device long before any of the recording devices we recognize today in the 21st century as. And we could also look at the tarot as maybe the first iPhones and iPads. They were able to see people at a distance. It was a very powerful technology when it was created, and when it was used in the right hands, very, very admired and very feared. There's a lot of history revolved around the tarot as to who these characters are. One deck, the Visconti Sforza deck, a very early on deck, shows how the tarot was applied in Italy and in the Western world. They created this deck based on people in their own family. This court had a prominence and a power, and at a big carnival had painted all of the major arcana to look like people of the history of their family. So when people came to visit and they stayed at that palace, they were given a tarot deck, which was gilded in gold, which would have been the equivalent in price to a modern day iPad. And the people would look through the deck to see if they made it in it, or to see if one of their friends or family members made it in it. That too is another really unique history that I will let you go explore on your own. Now, as astrology started to be applied to tarot, it gave us a new way of looking at the tarot symbolically and preserving their energies and powers. And that's what we're going to explore next. How to use astrology aspects with tarot cards. It's not too far-fetched if you think about it. In astrology, we have square, trine, opposition, and sextile, just to name a few aspects to utilize. Now, the square is 90 degrees apart, or 3 houses over from each house on the wheel that we discussed and talked about. Now, the square is exactly what it is. It is a block. This is a block of energy astrologically. So if there's a block astrologically, it means the energies aren't flowing the way that they should to be harmonious with each other. So a block in the tarot cards would come across as a reversed card. Here's a visual of how we can apply astrological aspects such as squares translated into reverse tarot card readings. In between two positive cards, the world comes up reversed. This then becomes a square. Now that you've seen the visual, it will help us to explain what happens with a trine, which is harmonious, which is when cards are harmonious with each other. A trine is 120 degrees apart from each house, and also 4 houses over. It's the most harmonious of the aspects in astrology, which means these planets have a harmonious conversation and work nicely and naturally with each other. And in tarot, we would find that some symbols and some cards do work harmoniously with each other. Now, opposition is also an important astrological aspect. When 2 planets are in opposition, it means they are equal apart distance from one another. And opposition doesn't always mean bump heads opposition. It just means they are on 2 different ends of the spectrum. I like to use Leo and Aquarius as the example. These are 2 signs that do well together. They don't oppose one another. They do have 2 different outlooks on doing things, but there is a little bit of Aquarius in Leo and a little bit of Leo in Aquarius. And when that energy is brought out, incredible imagination and feats of daring are accomplished. So they work well together. It's not a bumping of heads. But oppositions in the tarot would go to show and reflect possibly 2 cards that don't do well together and do bump heads. And this happens in the tarot as well too. And there's also, when using an opposition or a block, it could translate in tarot readings as a reversed card. Now, reversed cards go out of the scope of this video as well too, but I want to spend just a small moment on it. When I teach tarot, I always explain that to master reversals and to master your tarot is almost like breaking in a horse, so that the 2 of you can become one and not resist each other, so that there's clear communication. My clear communication suggestion is, when dealing with reversals in the tarot, already meditate and center yourself, and before you go any further, commit to, will you read reversals or will you not read reversals? Which means if reversals come up in the deck and you've chosen consciously not to read reversals, when they appear, you just turn them right side up, because there's enough other cards to denote challenges, obstacles, or bad things. If you do choose to read reversals, then it means that you are choosing to read the reversals and you have a clear communication with your cards, and you take the good, the bad, and the indifferent all together. Now, a couple of other aspects is the conjunction. It's the most powerful aspect in astrology and also plays the most powerful aspect in tarot card reading when applying this philosophy to it. Conjunction is when 2 stars or 2 planets are in one place or less than 8 degrees apart, and the energy can almost become combustible. Something like Venus and Mercury become conjunct. Now we know that Venus is the goddess of love and rules Libra and Taurus, and Mercury rules Gemini and Virgo. So these 2 planets rule dual signs and portray their energy in very different ways. When Venus is in Taurus, she plays the mother, the wife, and the businesswoman. When Venus is in Libra, she's the single gal, the lover, and the party girl. When Mercury is in Gemini, he is playful, mischievous, more fluid. When Gemini is in Virgo, he's particular, specific, and where communicating information is important, while in Gemini, communicating gossip and doing communication in a different way applies to when Mercury's in Virgo. So the conjunction becomes powerful when you have one round of cards, which usually means you put a spread down, and then you go for your second round, which means cards will overlay. That second card that overlays becomes your conjunction. Those two cards become one, which makes it interesting because they become a combustive power. And a combustive power in astrology is when two stars truly do come close together, like Mercury and the Sun. That's said to be combust when they can conjunct, because they are very close in proximity to each other already. So that power is quadruple increased. All right, quadruple is my over-exaggeration, but I think you get the point. Here we have the conjunction of the Fool and the Empress. Next up is the major arcana and astrological correlations or associations. We'll do a visual because it's much easier to see this than to just listen to it. So here, take a look. We begin with the Fool, and his correlation is Uranus or Mercury. Now we move on to the Magician, who is governed also by Mercury. The High Priestess, of course, has the moon as her astrological symbol. The Empress, of course, relates to Venus, the goddess of love. The Emperor correlates with the power of Aries, where the Hierophant comes across and is expressed as Taurus. The Lovers is represented by Gemini, and the Chariot receives the powers of Mars or Cancer. The Strength card, of course, is rewarded to Leo. And the Hermit is ruled by Virgo or Uranus. The Wheel is governed astrologically by Jupiter or Libra. And Our Lady Justice is ruled by Libra or Jupiter. The Hanged Man receives Neptune or Pluto. Whereas the Death card is given over to Scorpio. Temperance belongs to a few: Sagittarius, Virgo, or Aquarius. Our nefarious Devil card is given over to Capricorn or Saturn. The Tower card is Jupiter, Mars, or Uranus or Neptune. Whereas the Star is governed by Aquarius. The Moon is ruled by Cancer or Pisces. And the Sun card is a given. It's either the Sun or Leo. The Judgment card is governed by Libra, Pallas Athena, Jupiter, or Pluto. And finally, at the end of our trip, the world is governed by Leo, Aquarius, Virgo, and Scorpio. I'll let you figure out why. And we come back to the beginning. Now, there's a couple of other ways to look at the cards corresponding with astrology. Each major arcana either is or expresses the energy of the spirit of the star, such as the Empress is Venus, but the Hierophant expresses the zodiac sign of Taurus. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, there are 22 major arcana, but realistically, there are 22 physical cards, but there are 21 major arcana. And the Fool card is the bridge between the beginning and the end, or the end and the beginning, however you want to look at it. And there are 12 signs of the zodiac. Well, if we doubled up, there would then have to be 24 cards to match the zodiac and their ruling stars. So, to make this all work, with a little bit of metaphysical math involved, which I'll let you figure out, we get how major arcana cards either are or are expressed by either the guiding star or the zodiac. Meaning the Empress is Venus. When we look at the visual of the Empress in most old-fashioned decks, some contemporary decks are a little different, she usually is portrayed as Venus, the goddess of love, whether in just absolute beauty or connected to nature or pregnant or with a Cupid. Somehow we're relaying that the Empress is related to Venus, the glamorous, the loving, the beautiful. And where the Hierophant should have a connecting card, but in the school of thought we're using in this video, all of a sudden the Hierophant is expressed as Taurus, which doesn't make the Hierophant a bull. It just means that his symbology is expressed through Taurus, which, when you think of the Hierophant, that is, in a traditional sense, would be the person involved of marriages, which could be the Lover's card. We have to remember, the tarot card is a very traditional old tool. And although we've given it a lot of modern allusions, it was still created in a time where marriages, marriage contracts, the king, the queen, and everything from A to Z in the tarot was taken very seriously and respected. And in some tarot decks back in the day, they even did remove the high priest or the Hierophant and the high priestess and replaced them with something else. And then they made their way back, and so on and so on. So this is how we can also use the information of astrology and the tarot, as the card either is or is expressed by the astrological energy. Now, cut. We're going into practical use of the tarot and astrology. Woo! 3, 2, 1. Practical use of tarot and astrology, or astrology and tarot, comes down to calculating a birth chart and looking at where the planets are using their aspects and seeing what houses they're in, and then taking the corresponding tarot cards and placing them in the circle that the astrology chart looks like. That right there could give you a reading. Do you have 2 cards that conjunct at a planetary conjunction? What does that tell you? Do you have 2 cards that oppose? Do you have cards that square or also reverse with each other? So after looking at the birth chart and receiving the information in the many tomes of astrology books we use to look up the information on charts, we can also use the tarot as a bit of extra information or as a second opinion, so to say. The other way to use it is the practical use of planetary hours to create a horary chart with tarot cards. Now, astrological hours is when we calculate what hour of the day is dedicated to the astrological sign, such as Sunday begins with the first hour. And that's not 6 a.m. You have to look at it ephemeris, so you have to look at what time the sun comes up where you live and how long that hour is, because it's not an exact hour sometimes. Due to daylight savings time, it could be less, it could be more. I'll let you go look up astrological timing. There's plenty of apps out there as well too. And then come back to the video. Okay, good. You're back or you never left. But what you can do is do a horary chart, which means you do an astrology chart right there at the moment and the minute to see what exactly your horoscope is for the moment for a question you're asking. You can do this with the cards. You can look up your astrological hours and take it from there and then put your cards down and use that as a practical use. In this video, we only covered the major arcana. And in my class, the reason it's broken up into 2 days is because we have to cover a lot of information related to astrology, a lot of information related to the tarot, covering the major arcana and then applying all of the astrological information to the minor arcana. That gets very technical and really fascinating. If any of you are interested in that, you can contact me via AusetGypsy.com or get in touch with me at AusetGypsy Metaphysical Emporium here in historic Easton, Pennsylvania, and we can do a one-on-one video conference, or the next time I give the class, I hope to have it up online so that people can join us from wherever you are. I hope that this has helped intrigue you enough and not confuse you as to how to apply astrology and tarot from the AusetGypsy point of view, and I hope that it leads you into a deeper connection with your practice of either astrology or tarot or both. It's been my pleasure to present this video, and I look forward to doing more in the future. And until then, ciao.